This leg kick is called a counter-rotational break, or at least that's what I'm going to call it, because I haven't seen this concept discussed nearly enough in coaching circles. This is also a counter-rotational break, and so is this. Counter-rotational braking is a technique that allows you to better control your rotation through your hitting zone. And if you're not doing it right, you're going to hit both slower and less accurately. Because of that, mastering this class of movements has the potential to completely transform your forehand. Roger Federer is probably the most prolific counter-rotational breaker we've ever seen on tour, although Carlos Alcaraz is right up there with him and he utilizes it just as much as Federer did. In this video, we're going to cover the three main kinds of counter-rotational breaks you'll use on the forehand, as well as when to use them. But first, we need to discuss what counter-rotational braking actually is and why it works so well to power your forehand swing. Your hip rotation on the forehand has to be transient, which means it starts and stops. You don't just twist all the way through contact. And counter-rotational braking is what makes that work. The first thing a right-handed player does is they fire that right hip into the shot, and that creates the initial rotation. And then I want you to look at the counter-rotational break, which is this left leg coming up and forward, which is a rotation in the opposite direction. And that's the braking action. So we start by rotating into the shot. That rotational break with the left foot rotates the other direction, and that's what stops, or at least slows it, through the hitting zone, which creates that whip effect where the hips stop, the torso flicks through, and at the end, everything relaxes and goes the original way. What's so cool about this clip specifically is that Federer is hitting the same inside-out forehand using two different counter-rotational braking patterns to do basically the same thing, one with his right leg and one with his left leg. Here's the first one coming right here, where the right leg kicks back, and then the second one with the left foot there. It turns out lots of these lower body movement patterns you see are some form or another of counter-rotation. And the rest of this video is going to be about specific ways you can practice this and when to use different movement patterns to get the right kind of counter-rotation for different shots. Which brings us right to the first really common kind of counter-rotational break we're going to talk about, and it's the hitting leg kicking back behind the body to break your rotation while you're moving your weight forward into the court. What you're watching here is Alexa attacking these kind of floaty, usually pretty short, often high, bouncing up to the shoulders, kinds of balls that give so many people problems. So if you watch her hips on any given shot, the hips fire in, but the right leg fires back. So she's not just spinning around through the ball. There's a quick, transient twist, and then that's it. And then the torso goes through the ball by itself. So you need to practice driving through that right hip in a way such that it sends the right leg back behind your body. And even better, sends your entire body forward. If you can do that, you're going to get explosive rotation and weight transfer, and your body's going to stay on a line through the shot instead of spinning out past it. The second kind of counter-rotational break we're going to talk about is the left foot kicking up and sometimes kicking across the body, which again is a counter-rotation that slows or stops the right-handed player's initial rotation. And I'm playing all these forehands using that, no matter whether they're deep or short or wide. And that's one of the reasons that this particular counter-rotational break is so awesome, is it's so flexible. When you load up on your right foot, it's very natural to send your left foot in different directions to control your swing because your left foot's so free. Most of the time, you put most of your weight on your right foot and very limited weight on your left foot anyway. So it's very easy to allow the left foot to come off the ground in order to help you control your rotation. And I want to talk about this stroke specifically because it's not that pretty. And I know when you watch Roger Federer or Carlos Alcaraz perform these movements on the tour, it looks like they're this kind of superhuman thing that you have to be this like ridiculous level athlete to do. But what I want to stress is that the fundamental physics involved when they perform the movements versus when you perform the movements are the same. And so even if yours isn't going to be quite as good as theirs, it's not going to be quite as fluid or quite as balanced or quite as accurate, that doesn't mean you can't perform the same fundamental braking pattern and have the same kind of result, even if it's not quite as good as what they can do. The left foot up pattern is so useful because it's fault tolerant. You don't have to be perfect. You can be a little off balance, or you can be a little jammed or a little too far from the ball. But once you develop an athletic understanding of how to control your rotation using your left foot, you're going to be able to easily and intuitively adjust to those small mistakes and hit high quality shots even when you're not perfect. So right now you're probably thinking, okay, coach, this is all well and good. I kick my left foot forward, I kick my right foot back. How would I ever do this in a match under pressure? I can't run up to the ball thinking about my feet. If we look at this clip, Thomas Mahach is actually using both counter-rotational brakes together twice in a row against one of the best players in the world on set points. In order to execute at this level, it can't be something you're consciously thinking about. You have to just see ball, hit ball, see ball, hit ball. And the way to do this is to practice in such a way that these kind of counter-rotational movements become habit, and then your understanding of hitting the ball that you see in front of you involves these movements without you having to consciously do them. So how do we do that? Well, one of the best tools we can use is the medicine ball. And the reason is that it allows you to practice these early swing driving motions in an environment with great kinesthetic feedback. Kinesthesia, your sense of your body's movement. You get a lot of feedback from the extra weight of the medicine ball so that as you're trying to learn these movements, your brain can really sense what's going on and adjust to get the force production that you want. And this is a kind of tricky process because you want to make sure you're practicing the right things that are actually going to translate to the court, and then you're integrating them with other on and off court drills that make sure the entire stroke, not just this early driving motion, the entire stroke can sync itself up. If you want help with that, Alexa and I have a program that can help you do it because we know that the tips, the tricks, the techniques, they're helpful, but at the same time, it can all get a little frustrating and confusing because all you really want is to relax, hit the ball, and have it work. So we'll take all the guesswork out of it for you, guiding you through exactly how to practice in order to make something like counter-rotational braking a natural, habitual part of your game. So you won't need to constantly think while you play. We knit together highly kinesthetically stimulating workouts and training routines for you, much of it variations of the stuff Alexa trained with on tour, and we keep the training brief and dense because we know not everyone has infinite time to practice. We follow up with you periodically through video to make sure you're executing everything properly and you're not going to get stuck in any frustrating plateaus. So email us, coaches@faulttoleranttennis if you're interested, and there's also a link in the description with more details. We've covered the two most common dynamic rotational brakes you'll see. Our third one for this video is pressing through the front foot to prevent over-rotating through it. And this one's a little bit difficult to see because it's not dynamic. It's not a movement. It's just force production. With our previous counter rotations, you'd see a foot or a leg going in a direction. With this one, it's just that feeling of that foot pressing through the ground and resisting force. And it's hard to see that in video. So we're actually going to start this with the athletes that use this particular break to the highest degree, MLB pitchers. This is Jacob deGrom here, and we want to look at the behavior of that front leg as he comes through his release, which is what's analogous to tennis contact. So I'm going to play it even slower here. We've got a lot of force coming down the mound, and now look at that left knee. It's rotating out, and it's stopped rotating out, and we can even see in his follow-through, it rotates back in. That's how much force he's using to resist the continuing outward rotation. And if you look at that leg, it is perfectly still. He has perfectly translated all of his force to linear momentum by the time of that release. Now, in tennis, we have a lot of goals that aren't velocity, so it's uncommon to see that level of front foot counter-rotational break, but it's still used a lot, especially on lower balls where staying on the ground is beneficial because the ball's low anyway, and coming off the foot would make it difficult to play. And so what I've done here is I've interspersed a demo as best I could show what it looks like if you're in a situation where you should be pushing back against that foot and you don't, you let it twist out instead. So watch the front foot on the left here and watch how that's coming up off the ground right here, which shows you that I'm not pressing back through it, otherwise it would stay on the ground. And then if you watch the one where I hold the rotation longer, that foot is attached to the ground there, and I can feel the force that that left leg is generating to prevent the over-rotation. And right now you're probably thinking, I feel like I've seen players hop off their front foot, and you have, but most of the time that's not through contact, it's after contact. And through contact, there's some degree of force pressing back through that foot to prevent over-rotation and create that whip effect. If I pause it right at contact, you can see it. On the left, the one that I miss off wide, that foot is no longer pushing back against the body here. That heel is off the ground. There's no more force resisting rotation, whereas on the right, that foot is still planted. So we didn't quite press hard enough that we can't follow through with a hop, but we were pressing through the hitting zone rather than allowing the foot to come off the ground, which then doesn't provide that counter-rotational force. So let's close with an example of Roger Federer, who's famous for this kind of front foot hop approach pattern. But I want you to notice that through contact, that foot is planted on the ground, and it comes up as part of the follow-through. So obviously, it's going to depend on exactly what shot you're trying to play, especially how high the ball is. But all I want you to understand is that you have that degree of freedom of how much to resist your rotation using your front foot, not dynamically using static force into the ground, twisting into that hip and having that hip naturally flex and prevent rotating farther than that. That creates a whip effect, and it gives you more control over the contact zone. You're more likely to stay on a line through your target rather than shanking the ball off wide or having the chest flare open or something like that. Counter-rotational movements and counter-rotational braking is a very individualized thing. Different players use different counter-rotational breaks at a whole host of different frequencies, and they might even play the same ball differently than another player with respect to how they use their rotational and counter-rotational forces. The point of this video isn't to get you to try to do one thing, but rather to show you what's available to work into your practice to then try to work into your game. So for fun, we're going to close by going through one of the best points ever. You probably recognize it already. And just quickly count all the kinds of different counter-rotational movements that these guys elect to use as they play at the highest level.
I will never, ever forget that rally. Ridiculous! I will never, ever forget that rally.